Take up kind of where we were at last week with Lacey teaching. We were talking some about Abraham. We'll talk some about Isaac this morning to try to look at that. But we'll start in Genesis chapter 26. That's where we'll be at. Historical context. When we look at these, we kind of have to, as I always say, we look at these things in the context of where they're at to help us understand where they are. It's always interesting when you try to look back and think. Sometimes you think about stories that you read of people opening time capsules and those kind of things, and they pull things out of the time capsule that sometimes you shake your head and wonder why that got put in the time capsule or whatever else. They were. Then you have to go back and think about where it was, what was the connotation, kind of why we thought this was a big deal at the time. I mean, certainly if you would look back in the future and to look back to say kind of where it is, you would have never felt that it would have been where we are. I'm no longer a young whippersnapper, but I remember going to school with the old TI-81 calculator, the graphing calculator, which some of y'all might be old enough to remember the hibiscus, or Dad talked about the slide rule and learning to do math with a slide ruler, and we had the old TI-81, which we thought was the greatest thing. When you had one of those and had a memory in it and would remember things for you, and now you've got essentially a supercomputer that you answer phones on and text through that can do all the calculations that you'd want to do and has more computing power in the palm of your hand than they put man on the moon with. So kind of just where you're at, the time and the space of what's going on sometimes helps us understand where we were. If you look back and look at the chapters kind of around this, if you go back a few chapters, it'll kind of get us where we are in the time frame to start reading one of these chapters. It sometimes kind of drops us in the picture, but if we have to arrange the stories of where we're at in our head of all the stories that we've heard and all the stories that we remember, if you look back at chapter 23, Sarah, where Abraham is still alive. Sarah has passed away. And in chapter 24, you have Isaac and Rebekah, the story of Isaac and Rebekah, and if you forward one more chapter, you're in chapter 25, and Abraham dies, and it's the story of Abraham's death, and then we move into Jacob and Esau, and Esau selling his birthright, but we have to remember that while that story has occurred, they're essentially still young men. We haven't moved on really any further into the story of Jacob and Esau. We're stuck one last chapter, it seems like, one or two last chapters for the story of Isaac. You basically get the one chapter, the story of Isaac and Jacob, the story of Isaac and Rebekah, and then you get two more chapters of Isaac, chapter 26 and 27, and most of this is chapter 26. This is essentially the story of Isaac's life. When we look through chapter 26, you get one more chapter of basically the last ceremony that ties the story in chapter 24, where Isaac, or chapter 25, where Esau sells his birthright, and then we see the culmination of that dozens of years later, when Jacob is now over 100 years old, and he's about to die. But right there in the middle is this chapter 26. When we look at Genesis chapter 26, it tells the story of Isaac, and the story of Isaac starts in Genesis chapter 26 and verse 1. Now there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, into Gerar. And the Lord appeared unto him and said, Go not down to Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and I will bless thee. For unto thee and unto thy seed will I give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and I will give unto thy seed all these countries. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now, when we look at this place of Isaac's life, remember we reviewed the chapters before. Abraham has received the covenant, and we can read back through those multiple chapters of Abraham's life. And Abraham had received the covenant to go into a land which he knew not of, and he pulls his family out, and they travel over to this new land, to this promised land as it was. But here we are. Abraham has passed away. We have this place of Isaac's life where we see that Isaac, once again, overgoes a famine. If we look at chapter 25 and verse 11, Isaac was living by a well that his father had dug. And here we relocate to where there's water. So the place that we were was a famine. It become dry, it become parched. And at some point, historically, Isaac had lost a good bit of what he had. So Abraham had a large amount of flocks, but as the famine came through, they began to lose sheep, they began to lose things, and so he begins to travel. And this very much a picture of what happens in Abraham's life. In fact, chapter 26 and verse 1 starts off that way. Besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. So years before, there had been a famine that Abraham had to go through, and Abraham goes into Egypt, and Isaac was beginning to do that same thing. My father went to Egypt. Egypt has the Nile River that has a little bit more of an abundant water supply. They have a tendency to be a little more resistant to drought because of some of the rivers and stuff that they have, and the way the Nile Delta is set up. They're a lot more resistant to droughts and famines because of their water source that they have, and it's just right on the place where it is. If you slip down around the Mediterranean Sea, you don't have to go that far. There's a border of Israel and Egypt together, so you can kind of slip into Egypt, into the northern end of Egypt, which is where the Nile Delta is, and you can kind of pass out. The famine goes away and you go back. So that was the natural course of things that happened because of the resiliency of the Nile Delta for famines. And so Isaac was going to go there, as was historically had happened, and God stops him and says, no, you have to stay. I want you to stay here at this land. This is your promised land. This is the place that you're supposed to be. This is where I want you to be. And then we see in verse 3 and 4 that God is reiterating the blessings of Abraham to Isaac. God is reminding him of what he promised Abraham. Sojourn in this land, I will be with thee. I'll bless thee, for thee, thy seed, thy countries. So very reminiscent of what God had spoken to Abraham as he's telling this, he's passing this on to Isaac. This is the official passing of the Abraham covenant. We see this once again at the end of this. God is beginning to pass this on to Isaac. He's reminding him of the very nature in verse 5. He says, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charges, my commandments, my statutes, and my law. And he says there in verse 4, and you see this continuation of how God does covenants. You see this continuation of how God says, if you will, I will. Isaac, I need you to stay here. Isaac, you need to stay here. This is your promised land. If you'll sojourn in this land, I'll be with thee. I'll bless thee. If you'll do this, I this. This is how God creates covenants and how covenants work. That the mantle of the promise had been passed on to Isaac. We can see the faith aspect of this. We can recall Abraham's faith where God says, you need to go, and the trials of Abraham and what was discussed last week. And we can remember that Abraham has that, but Isaac is getting to that point that Isaac is getting to the point that this is his turn, that he has to have his faith, that it's no longer Abraham's faith, which is what's working. We're not no longer working on Abraham's faith. We're no longer manifesting Abraham's faith. We're no longer dependent on him. Abraham has passed away. The mantle has passed on to this new, younger generation. And this is where we are. And there's some of us in that class that that are in this class that are getting to that point that you're no longer living on the faith of your fathers. You're no longer living on the faith of your mothers. This is your turn. Some of us have moved on past that, and we can recall that of where we grew up in church, and this is what we knew, and church is what we had. And as I always say, there's teeth marks all over South Alabama. They're chewed on church pews growing up, and then you kind of move on from where we are to that. But there become a point, and I distinctively remember that point in my life when it had to become my faith. It was my decision of whether we went to church. It was my decision whether we went to Sunday school. It was my decision whether we made Wednesday night. It was my decision whether we went when it was tired. It was my decision to go to do what was done. It became our faith that made the decision. Was I going to trust God for my needs? Was I going to depend on Him? Was I going to do these things that I learned and what was true? And that's the place that Isaac is in this place in his life, is it's his turn for his faith. And we're going to see this happen. God says, Isaac, this is your turn to have faith. And many of us may still be into that place that we maybe never faced a situation like we are, but this is God saying, this is your turn to have faith. We can see that we're no longer walking in Abraham's footsteps. We're no longer following the caravan. We're no longer just along with Dad. And Isaac and Rebekah had gotten married and kind of followed in with Abraham, and they just followed Abraham and followed Abraham's footsteps for years they were. But now Abraham has passed away, and Isaac has become the leader of the band, if you say, and it's Isaac's decisions to what matter. But along with that comes great responsibility if he has to make the decision of what we do. Are we going to stay in this place? Or are we going to stay where the famine is? Or are we going to try to eke it out here? Are we going to try to survive here? What are we going to do? Where we're at in the well that we were at in verse 25 and 11, it says he's in Laharai. He's got a well that his dad had dug. And this was Abraham's property that I was there, but yet it's failing. What do I do here? And sometimes that's a difficult place to be if you've never been in that place where you're in a place that seems like there's failure all around, and what do I do? But sometimes God gets us uncomfortable to move us, and that's where we are right now. If we look down to verse 12, and we can see in verse 12 then that Abraham, the verse is there, that Isaac had moved to a place. Now, he gets to a place, then Isaac sowed in that land in chapter 26 and verse 12. Then Isaac sowed in that land and received in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man waxed great and went forward and grew until he became very great, for he had possession of flocks, possession of herds, and a great store of servants, and the Philistines entered him. For all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. And Abimelech said unto Isaac, Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we. So what had happened here, it's a little difficult to see. Remember, Isaac had been in a place that he had basically lost cattle, he had lost sheep, he had lost all of these. He had to move. He was in a downward swing in his life, and he had gotten to a place that, as I have to leave because of the famine, we're starving, we're losing, we have to move out from here. And then he moves to another place, and these are system, they're not very far away from our standpoints of modern travel and our standpoints of thought process, but on a map for them, it was a little bit far of a move. He moved several times. He moves from a place of around Beersheba, that he moves up to a place to try to find a place that has water, and moves along, and he's moving multiple times through this. Doesn't seem like a whole lot till you realize you're moving, picking up your house and moving tents and moving all this. So he goes through this, but he gets in a place that he does something that he kind of changes the where it was. He had lived a very Bedouin lifestyle, a nomadic lifestyle, moving from here to there, but he begins to plant and he begins to sow seed, and he received in the same year 100-fold. Now this is the highest numerical value that the Bible gives to any crop increase. If we read in Matthew we read there in Matthew when he talks about some was tenfold, some 20-fold, some 100-fold. Very same. We're at the top crust historically. This is probably 100-fold plus that he received. It's almost like they quit counting. When you start getting 100-fold increase on your crops, that's pretty good increase. The most I've ever done historically, if you get 25%. If you get 25 times increase, 25-fold increase, you're doing probably about average. You plant one seed and you grow 25. You plant 1 pound of potatoes and you grow 25 pounds of potatoes. I never got that good. I could plant and get about a 10-fold increase on potatoes. I could plant 50 pounds and get 500 pounds of potatoes out. That's about as best I ever did. Isaac could plant a pound of potatoes and get 500 pounds, or he could plant 5 pounds of potatoes and get 500 pounds of potatoes. He could plant... He could plant 50 pounds of wheat and gather 2.5 tons of wheat off of that. So that's a pretty good increase plus of where he was at. So very quickly, he moved up in the ability to take care of himself and the ability to see the blessings that he had. Now, nobody around him was having that much of an increase. That was a pretty fertile valley where he was at, but it was not the highest. Nobody else around him was getting that much wheat. When I plant wheat, that's what I get. When I plant barley, I plant a pound of barley and I get 100 pounds of barley out. I plant a ton, I get 100 tons of barley back out. That's a pretty big increase. And so everybody around him began to get jealous of what Isaac is doing. And we see this happen, that we see the jealousy begin to take place. And everybody was not super happy. Well, when you have flocks and you have, and looking at this from a farming standpoint, when you can graze cattle and graze sheep, you're going to get a certain amount of growth off of them. You're going to get a certain amount of increase from them. But when you have the ability to feed them grain on a daily basis, your growth is going to be substantially more. I am not a very good shepherd or cattleman, but I've raised 2 or 3, and you start feeding them grain, and they just really get a lot bigger, and they have bigger. And so that's what's happening here in Isaac's life, is he has the ability to go from being a nomad farmer where we graze a little bit here, and then they essentially walk it off. They what you graze, they walk that off, trying to get to the next grazing and the next day, and you're moving them around, and so they walk a lot of the calories off. Well, Isaac starts to change the agriculture aspect of where he's at. He begins to plant. And he says, we'll grow the food. Instead of moving around, we begin to see him doing something that had never been done throughout his life. His dad didn't do this, that he begins to grow food. And he's had such a bountiful blessing that everybody around him is envious. And so they say it must be the land, so they want to take the land from him. Now, when we back up and look at this, we can see in several places here that in verse 15, for all the wells which his father's servants had digged in the days of Abraham his fathers, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. Now, that really, in our standpoint, doesn't make a whole lot of sense of why you would do that. Why would they stop the wells up that Abraham had dug? I've moved into a few places that have some wells, and I've never decided, hey, I don't like that well, I'm going to just pour concrete down it and stop the well up to keep it from working. Most of us don't understand, but to understand the connotation of what's happening here and understand the historical significance of what's happening here, we have to realize that because Abraham dug that well, or Abraham had that well dug, he essentially had rights to that land. Because he had dug the well, he had rights to the land. And so when the Philistines would come in, they would fill the wells of Abraham up because they didn't want him to have the rights to the land any longer. They were trying to remove the rights of Abraham off this. In fact, if you look back through the story of Abraham, you'll see in one point that Abraham actually, pulls a deal with Abimelech, which is more likely the name of the king, that it's not the same person, and we read that name multiple times throughout the Bible. That was their name for their ruler. And so we see that Abraham actually had made a deal, said, look, I dug this well, this is mine. You have to say, this is my land because I dug the well. Yes, that's your land, you dug the well, so therefore you own the rights to it. And so what the Philistines were trying to do was remove the rights. that Abraham had. And so when Isaac come in and redug the wells that his father had dug, he was reminding them that this was my land. This is an inheritance of mine. And so when he would redig the wells, he would remind them, my father dug this well originally, and so I redig this well, and I'm just reminding you that this is my land. And so that was the reason for the anger and the angst that you see around them and see. So if we read on a few more verses, verse 17. So we read in 14 and 15, he had dug a well, and they had stopped and filled them up with earth. We go to 17. Isaac departed thence, Genesis 26 and 17. And Isaac departed thence and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelled there. And Isaac digged again the wells of water, which they had digged in the days of Abraham his father. For the Philistines had stopped them after the death of Abraham. And he called their names after the names by which his father had called them. And Isaac's servants digged in the valley and found there a well of springing water. And the herdsmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen, saying, the water is ours. And he called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him. And they digged another well and strove for that also. And he called the name of it Sitnah. And he removed from thence and digged another well, for they that strove, and for that they strove not. And he called the name of it Rehoboth. And he said, for now the Lord hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. So we see that God is moving Isaac from where he was to the place that he wants him to be. So Isaac's moving. He goes to this. My father dug this well. He redug the well. He renamed the place the name that Abraham had. Just because you've closed this up, just because you've shut this down, doesn't mean that it's still not mine. And so we have to realize that he redigs this well. Now, for us to kind of realize where these were, Isaac, the wells that he were digging, they're estimated to be 12 feet wide and 135 feet deep. I've talked about this some in the past. This well is estimated to be 12 feet wide and 135 feet deep, and often bored through solid rock. And so the wells that he was digging were not an easy circumstance to dig. This wasn't going out and putting in a 25-foot, 3-foot shaft and digging down and then coming back up. We've got an old well on Dad's property back home. That's essentially what it is. It's 3.5, 4 feet wide, goes down. It doesn't go down 35 feet at the most. And those are the wells that we're used to digging. And that was through clay and something else. But these are hand-bored wells, often through solid rock that he's digging. So these were quite that's the reason why you own the land. When you put the sweat equity in for the well, then you own the land. So these are some substantial wells that he's digging, because you got to remember he's got a crop of he's got crops to water, but also sheep and herds to have that need tens of thousands of gallons of water a day. They have to have quite a substantial water source to stay out. That's the whole point of him having to move to dig the well. So this is happening. We find him that he's moving several times. What's happening here is God is moving him from place to place. Now, it could have been just as easy when God spoke with him back in the first few chapters and said, don't go to Egypt. He could have told him just as easy, this is the place that you need to go. Here's a map. Here's the red dot. Go to this. X marks the spot. That's where you need to be. Sayonara. I'll meet you there. God didn't do that. We see that he puts them, that God is moving him in the place that he wants him to go. And it doesn't make sense. Sometimes you would say, why did Isaac have to go through this? Why did Isaac have to go through these places? And in God's timing, we have to realize sometimes our suffering is God's direction. He is teaching us and leading us in our suffering. Why do I have to go through these things? Sometimes it's just the way life is, and sometimes God is using that, and we see this in Isaac's life where God is using that to move him from the place that you are, that the place that I want you to be has to be a journey. Sure, we can do a straight line and say this is where you need to go, this is what needs to happen, but this removes all the faith aspect of walking by faith and not by sight. If God immediately says if God immediately reveals and says this is where you need to go, this is the place that you need to go here, Isaac, dig a well, boom, you're done, you can live there for the rest of your life, then Isaac misses the journey that goes on through that. And we see the name of the two wells that he has. If you look there in here, we see that he names this well. The first name is the well that he dug. He dug a well, and he names this Esek because they strove with him. That is the name. He said, there's so much strife here. That's what I'm going to name this place. There's so much to do here, but I'm going to move on. Isaac is overall a man of peace. We don't see him as a man of war. We don't see him having the army that his father had. We don't see him having the ability to take on a nation state as we see that Abraham did, that he takes on a nation state and frees hostages in the stories of Abraham having that militant power. Isaac doesn't have that. Isaac is much more a man of peace. And so when they push up against him, Isaac says, okay, I'm going to step. And he moves off, and he moves about 8 miles each time. We see him moving just 5 to 10 miles, 8 miles. He's moving, and he digs another well. Okay, this well, you don't want us to be here. They strive a lot. We move on. But we see this place of strife, and this place, the next place that he digs, is Sitnah, and they digged another well. They strove for that also. That term for that is contention or hostility. So without the strife and contention and hostility, with Isaac have understood the peace and open spaces of Rehoboth, we see that God moves him along this journey. Sure, he had a couple of places of hardship, but it was only because of those places of hardship that Isaac is able to understand when he gets to Rehoboth, this is where I need to be. I finally found a place that God finally made room, that we're finally in a place that he dug another well. So God hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. Isaac had to go through that journey to understand where he was at. There had to be some suffering on the journey for Isaac to understand the good times. You've got to have the bad times. You've got to have the times of turmoil. You've got to have the times of struggle. You've got to have the times of difficulty to understand and appreciate the blessings of where it's at. Riding down the road this morning, it's a little chilly. You reach down and you punch the little button, and so the seat that you're sitting on warms up to get you warm. And if you got the right vehicle, you can punch the other button and the steering wheel warms up. And man, it's awful nice to ride on for that. But there were many days that you didn't have that. If you've been around long enough and you've lived life and not had the blessings that you have now, but maybe you learn to appreciate them a little bit more. You learn to appreciate the fact that you got, as I'd said before, vehicles that you can get in that just drive, that you've got, a heater that you can control off your phone. If you've got it linked up to the Wi-Fi, you just change the temperature. You ain't got to move from where you're at. So those are the blessings that you're at, but without the strife, without the previous time in our life, that you may not appreciate the blessings as much as where there are. So I encourage us sometimes to see as we're going through that journey of life, sometimes we do hit hardships, and those are not accidental places that God accidentally puts us. Those are places that God puts us. Sometimes we have to get to the place that I've had to be in my life that I literally prayed, God, please let me learn the lesson that I'm supposed to learn here so I can move on from this. I am tired of being here in this classroom, to this spot in life, that I was going through a struggle. I don't know why I'm still here. Apparently I'm failing the test. Help me to pass this test so we can move on past this point. I can learn whatever it is I need to learn and move on. And that's sometimes where God is. We see that in Isaac's life, that God brings him through a place of turmoil, that God brings him through, but that is also the place that Isaac has to make the decisions of faith for himself. It's in those times of struggle, it's in those times of hardship that we make the decisions of faith that really matter. It's easy to serve God in the blessings. It's easy to serve God in the hard. Oh yes, I love the Lord. He's been so good to me. Are you still going to say that if something bad happens? Are you still going to say that when struggle comes? Surely I hope so. But in that point in time, that's when we learn who we are, and we learn how much we love God, and God learns how much whether we're for real. We have to go through the struggle to get to the blessings. Sometimes we have to understand the struggle. We have to understand those things to get to the blessings. It'd be nice to not have to go through that, but we have to understand that those times occur. So when we see this in Isaac's life, remember, this is what happens. This is Isaac fulfilling his part of the covenant. God says, if you will, I will. When you fulfill your part of the covenant, I'm able to bless you. When you've done these things, Isaac, this is where you're supposed to be. I don't want you to go to Egypt. I don't want you to go where you might think it's going to be easier. Sometimes you got to do a little suffering, and he's teaching us and is leading us through strife, through contention, through hostility, through the hard spots to get to the other side, to get to that peace and get to those open places. He's doing all things. When he says he does all things for our good, this is what it means. Sometimes it's difficult to go through that. It's part of the covenant as he's walking us through there. There'll always be problems. That's a fact of life. Our response to the problem is to what matters. Our response to this is what matters, and where we can get to the place that God is able to get us to where we are. So we see this man of peace, this man of, and he has the right. He's reclaiming. He's redigged the wells. He's reminding them that these were dug by his father. This is my inheritance claim. The traveling nomads around them understood. That's what's the understanding thing is they understood what was going on, and that's the reason why they fought him so much through this. And they didn't want Abraham to have the rights. Abraham digs these wells over and over and over. Isaac goes along and digs them over. This is my promised land. I'm going to go over here and dig a well. This is my promised land. I'm going to go over here and dig a well. This is part of my promised land. Abraham's doing this for the generations that are behind him. Isaac does the same thing for the generations that are behind him, because one day my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, they're going to live on this spot. I'm not digging the well for me. I'm digging it for them. So sometimes in the middle of our struggle, we have to realize that we should not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we'll reap if we faint not. Sometimes we do things that we may not understand that where you're at. I was having a discussion with my brothers and talking about it with Dad. Sometimes you see people do things and you wonder why. And this is talking about in construction. You've ever got to a piece of property, or ever had to do any property or rebuild or some of the other stuff. Sometimes you look to say, "Now, why in the world did they do that? Why would they do it like that?" Well, because it got the job done for them, and so that's well enough. But 25 years down the road, when the next guy has to come along, 5 years down the road, when the next guy comes along, then you've got to clean up what they did, fix everything, and then fix it right. Because then I try to teach Ben, and my dad had taught us, hey, if you're going to do it right the first time so you don't have to do it again. Now, there are times that the pipe breaks and it's freezing and you just got to temporarily fix it so the water will come on and the lights will work, or whatever it is that you're working on, and you got to temporarily do it. But if you're going to spend the money, do it right the first time and get it done. And so that's what Abraham and Isaac are doing here, is they're putting the hard work in with the realization that it's not only for me, but it's also for the children. And we have to understand that it's often that same way in our Christian walk. It might be easy to be in a place to take the easy road out and to take the easy walk and to say, well, this is all right. But you understand that if you'll look a generation or two in the future, what are we leaving for our children? And we see this, the work that Abraham and Isaac, the work that Abraham does, Isaac's able to come along behind, and then very soon thereafter, and again, this is just a very short story of where we're at, a very short picture of just a chapter or two, 3 chapters all together that tell the story of Isaac in Genesis. It's not that much of a story when you compare to the vast number of chapters that are dedicated to Abraham, and then to the vast number of chapters that are dedicated to Jacob and the beginning of Israel and the tribes of Israel and the formation of that, and then the chapter after chapter after that. We're just here with our 2.5 little chapters. It's about where we're looking at the story of Isaac. But yet you see a man here who's willing to take the road less traveled. He's willing to be in a place that he suffers the hardship, and he's willing to put the time in because he knows that it's God's will and the blessings of the Lord are coming. It's his turn to carry the covenant. He doesn't see the blessings. That comes in Jacob's life. He doesn't see the outcome. That comes in Jacob's life when Jacob's renamed Israel and has the children and starts the 12 tribes and all that happens. Isaac doesn't see any of that. He passes on and just barely passes the inheritance over to Jacob and moves on. And in the next chapter, Isaac dies without seeing any of this happen. He doesn't see, but he knows that it will happen. He knows there is a time. He knows that there is a day that this is going to take place. But he's willing to put the time in to say, this is what's going to happen. He's willing to put the time in to sow the land, to shape this. I'm going to just I'm going to change. I'm going to continue on. Yep, it's hardship. I'll have to move on. I have to move yet again. Here we are. We're packing up the tents yet again. Where we're going to move to. We're going to try another place just over there. We're going to go 5-10 miles down the road. We're going to try again. We'll set back up. We'll redig that well. I know that Dad has another well there. We redig this one. Those didn't work. I'll dig another well. I'll continue on. I'll continue to do this. It's just what he does as he moves the things along. And as he moves along, we see this in the story of Isaac, that he is faithful in what he does. It doesn't seem like he doesn't get the glory out of it. He doesn't get the praise out of it. When we look through, it's just the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We focus sometimes on Abraham and focus sometimes on Jacob, and rightfully so. The story is there. But yet we are here with such a quiet spirit that he had. He's strong in non-resistance. It seems like he yields after the quarrel. He's strangely out of place in the wild times and the wild days of fighting the Philistines. And they wanted to fight him on every standpoint. And he realized, I can't fight you. You've got an army. You've got lands. I'm not going to fight you. I'm going to move on. He's going to move on a little bit. He moves on a little bit further. And we see that his meekness and his spirit is rewarded. He doesn't meet violence with violence. He doesn't try to attack. He doesn't try to do these things. He says that this is where we are. I'll move along and I'll just keep rowing on. He says, they're minor. They're going to push him out. We see that happen over and over, that he's pushed out over and over, that time after time that he's pushed over. But yet we see that Isaac takes into his safe to wait. And he takes what seems to be the low road, as they would say, as he moves on. But yet, in the end, we see that he's finally in the place that God wants him to be. Now, he eventually moves back to the homeland of Beersheba. He eventually moves back to where God can have him. And all of this movement and all of this motion and all of this that happens, he's got one more movement that's left, that God gets him to where he wants him to be. That he finally gets there. He digs another well in Genesis chapter 21 and 30. And there we find Isaac in this place in verse 30. And in chapter 26, he finally gets to this place. Sorry, I skipped down a little bit too far there. It's in 20. And so in 23, he went up thence to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared unto him in that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee. I will bless thee, and I will multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he builded an altar there, and he called upon the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants digged a well. So he's in that place, that he gets to that place, that he's over and over doing, it seems like, strife, contention, hostility. Strife, contention, hostility. Everybody's against him. Everybody's there. Everybody's fighting him. But yet we see him as a man of peace, a man that says, okay, he moves on a little bit further because he realizes I'm not where I need to be yet. I'm continuing to strive. God moves him one place to another. When he finally gets to that place of settlement, when he finally gets to that place of settling, we see that that's where he is. He lives out the rest of his days in that place of where he's at. But if God's finally moving him to the place that he wants him to be, he understands that I've got to have clean water. I've got to have a place. I got to have this. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at where he digs these wells, he often digs these wells right beside a river or a stream, right beside a place that has flowing water, that he digs this well because Isaac understands the desire for this well is not as much for today, but this is a time for later. This isn't, I don't dig the well for the day that the stream is flowing and then it's raining and the water's coming. I dig for the well for the time that is a hard time. Because he realizes the cycle of life is at some point in time that stream will dry up. At some point in time it's going to go away. But we've got to have something in place to withstand the hard times. And so we see this over and over. He moves to the valley. If you look at the historical context here and you look at where he moves in and pull it up, there's a stream there. There may be even a little river there. There may be something there that his sheep and cattle can live off of. But he says, I've got to put the work in today for the hard times that are tomorrow. So when the famine comes again in my children's life, that we've got something that we can go to. When the hard time comes again, it may not even be in my lifetime. We may not have another drought in my lifetime to the point that it dries the land up. But we may get a little bit of low when it's not raining and things get a little dry and we have to use the well. But he says, I put this in today for my children tomorrow. He puts us in looking at the next time. So when we look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he seems to be just a bridge, and that's what he looks at and how he looks in history as a bridge from Abraham to Jacob, from the blessings of the promise. But such as it is in our life, that we have to look forward to realize, what are we doing? How's it going to affect our children? How's it going to affect our grandchildren? How's it going to affect those around us? Do we stay faithful? Are we like Isaac was? Do we stay in a place that we continue to push, that we continue to try? Do we continue to go? Do we continue to say, it's a bit of a hard time, I'm in the middle of strife and contention, but I'm looking for something better. But I realize that I've got to put this down in this hard time. I've got to put the work in today so my children can have something better. So when I look forward and say, I'm passing this along, I want to pass on what I've got. I want to pass on the inheritance. I want to pass on the blessings. I want to pass on all these things. Help me not to be in a place that I just pass on the financial blessings that God has gave me and not pass on the spiritual blessings of what it is. As much as I want to leave my children, a blessing, what I want to do more than anything else is leave them in a spiritual inheritance that they will have in their life, that when they get done and say, God was faithful, Isaac is able to look at Abraham's life and say, God was faithful to Dad. God kept him and God was faithful to him. So when we read that first verses in chapter 26, when God is initially talking to Isaac the first time, and we see this, that God's talking to him and saying, this is the covenant. This is what I want you to do. If you will, I will. Isaac's able to look at Abraham's life, and I can see where God kept Dad. I can see where God kept him. And if I live this same life, he'll do the same thing for me. And that's the hope that I can leave for my children, that if I can say that when they're grown, that they can say, I saw what God did for Mom and Dad. I'd like to have that same thing in my life. I'd like to live the same life of blessing. I'd like to live the same life of a purpose. I'd like to live the same life of having a hope. I'd like to live the same life of having a future, that I can live in a place that I too can have the same covenant with God that they did. And that's the hope of the life that you live, is that you hope not only can I pass on to the children, not only can I pass on to the grandchildren the financial blessings that we have in life, but I want to pass on a spiritual inheritance that says, if I'll serve God, if I will, He will. If I'll stay faithful to Him, He'll stay faithful to me. If I'll stick with Him in the hard times of strife, and I stick with Him in the hard times of contention, that I can realize that the blessings of the Lord will continue as well. It's good to be here this morning. So we look at the life of Isaac as a life. It seems like he doesn't have the outstanding stories, but the biggest part of the story is Isaac stays faithful to God and he serves God in his own time.